Hey, it's Jamie again, and over my career, I've seen more software projects fail due to misusing user stories than probably any other practice related to Agile software development. Years ago, when I first started developing software, this was right before Agile methods for software development were really common and a lot of people were doing it. Teams usually wrote big documents that they'd have to put together to describe what a software product was going to do before anybody would even start working on any of it. And since the projects were typically designed up front, they were also funded up front. The more detailed the team could make those documents about what the software has to actually do, the more accurate typically the estimate of the cost of the project would be. But companies were finding that by the time the team delivered the software product, customers didn't really want it anymore. So early leaders in the Agile sort of software development community, they came up with this brilliant idea to only build a little slice or a little piece of a software product at a time and then actually release it to customers in a sort of half-baked or partial state to get feedback. This would actually let your software team change their mind about what's going to be in the product once the project's already underway. Since it takes a long time to document something that you might not build to the level that it needs to be written down so you can actually estimate it, the industry came up with user stories. The thought was, how do we describe just the minimal information about a feature so we know what value it offers to the customer without writing up a full specification for that feature? But there were still many leaders and business owners and clients and customers that they wanted to know, what am I getting for my money? I want to know exactly up front, how much is this project going to cost and what exactly am I getting for it? So they really ended up forcing the team to estimate and scope the work anyway, even though they might be calling it an Agile project, because they were really just too scared to fund a software project without knowing exactly what they're getting ahead of time. So there are many Agile coaches out there that will tell you a user story is just a placeholder for a future conversation. Once the team actually gets started on working on that user story, they'll talk to the product manager or the customer and find out the details then. The problem is, once this conversation was actually held, many new details emerged about the work. And these new details actually caused the estimate that the team originally came up with based on the user story to go way up. We can't predict the full work and thus the full cost with just a user story. If your stakeholders are focused on cost, it's much smarter for you to write detailed acceptance criteria for every single user story you come up with, well ahead of giving any estimate out to any of your stakeholders. Acceptance criteria is really just more documentation that you write, and it describes how somebody would actually go through and use some aspect of the software, or how an automated test might be written to actually verify its operation, but with no ambiguity. It goes into a lot more detail than a user story, but it's really what a software team needs to actually build that user story and make sure there's no miscommunication about what it should and shouldn't do, so it can really be estimated and everybody knows, if I go through and I follow these steps in the acceptance criteria and they all behave the way we described it, then that feature is done. See, if you don't have acceptance criteria and you give a rough estimate out to someone, you're just giving them a number that's practically guaranteed to change once you jump into it and find out the real details by creating the acceptance criteria. And every time that estimate does change, you're going to lose trust with your stakeholders because they may look at it like you don't know how to estimate or you don't know what you're doing. Now, if you have stakeholders that do understand Agile, you'll actually want a very high level user story only estimate. This is because you may never build it. So spending the time and effort writing all the acceptance criteria is actually a waste of time and money until you're sure that the team's really going to invest in it in that current sprint or that current set of Kanban tickets. See, if your team really is Agile and you're budgeted monthly and your team's only writing user stories, when they go in to implement that user story, if they find out through having a conversation with the product product owner that it's more complicated than they thought and it may take more time. If the team's budgeted monthly, it won't matter because the team will make the best decision about how do we design this feature that's best for the customer, that's actually going to meet our business outcomes. And the cost of that feature will be less of a concern because the whole team is funded to build really whatever's highest priority within a given month. Remember, on a truly agile project, building the features that are going to make the most money and have the biggest impact for customers is what's important, not the cheapest features or controlling the costs and being able to predict things up front. If we only work in a way that allows us to predict, then we're going to make it harder to build things that we can't predict. Much more than trying to maximize the work the team can get done, it's about making sure the team's doing the right work. So when you're trying to decide, should we use user stories? Should we not? When do we give estimates out? When do we write acceptance criteria? My recommendation to you would be to be very careful and to actually match the level of detail that you go into with your user stories or your requirements, whatever format you're using, with the level of certainty that your management and your stakeholders require. If your stakeholders are focused on cost, certainty, and predictable deadlines, writing only user stories and committing to those estimates without acceptance criteria is really foolish. It's like committing to a multi-year waterfall project with only 10% of the documentation that a team normally puts together to accurately estimate it. So are you on a team that's using user stories to describe your project? Are you giving out rough estimates without acceptance criteria to other people that actually expect things to be much more certain than they really are on an Agile project? Leave me some comments below. If you're new to my YouTube channel, consider subscribing, and you can always listen to these also as a podcast on Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or iTunes. Just search for Healthy Software Developer and you'll find me there. So until next time, thanks.